In the corridors of power and pixel, where syllabi are redacted, algorithms inherit bias, and triage becomes triage by identity, three pillars tremble: education, technology, and healthcare. CRT and DEI, once academic lenses and community building tools, have become battle cries, symbols, and scars. In schools, fear dictates curriculum. In tech, ethics are coded with disclaimers. And in hospitals, equity is debated at the bedside. Welcome to the J-Spot Lounge, peeps, where we unpack the cultural battlegrounds beneath polite society. And while the walls may growl truth, tonight we're listening deeper. Tonight's episode, the Shadow of the Discourse. Let's get right to it, shall we? And so let's examine first education and the curriculum as a culture war. CRT is often mischaracterized as being taught in K through 12 schools, despite its origins in legal academia. DEI programs in schools, such as inclusive curricula, affinity groups, and bias training, are conflated with CRT and targeted by legislation. States like Texas, Iowa, and Florida have passed laws banning CRT and DEI-related content in public universities and agencies. And so from that perspective, we have to talk about Baldwin's talk to teachers as a CRT blueprint. Baldwin argued that, quote, education is designed to perpetuate the aims of society, unquote, which is a direct echo of CRT's assertion that institutions reflect dominant ideologies. Baldwin's call for teachers to help students by, quote, examining the society in which they are being educated, unquote, aligns also with DEI's push for culturally responsive pedagogy. And so then what we're left with the curriculum as a culture war are cultural tropes. Schools are framed as ideological battlegrounds where woke indoctrination threatens traditional values. Teachers and librarians become symbols of resistance or villainy, depending on political lens. Education is portrayed as either a tool for liberation or a threat to national unity. And so then we are left with this question: are we educating for liberation, or are we educating for obedience? And so we go from education to technology, where innovation meets ideology. Major tech firms like Google, Meta, and IBM have rolled back DEI initiatives under political and shareholder pressure. Executive orders and lawsuits have led to the removal of diversity hiring targets in DEI departments. DEI language is being scrubbed from public filings, and diversity officers reassigned or simply dismissed. And Baldwin warned us about identity and myth when he said, quote, what passes for identity in America is a series of myths about one's heroic ancestors, unquote. Now, this critique of myth-making parallels how tech platforms use algorithms to reinforce dominant narratives. And I'm sure anybody who's on YouTube and who follows a certain topic, once you watch it several times, especially if you like the video with a thumbs up, your algorithm will Every time you click on YouTube, that algorithm will fill your channel or your space with what you've watched previously. They will reinforce that dominant narrative about a certain subject that you possess, that you hold on to. And then, the DEI in tech often stops at representation. But Baldwin pushed us deeper. And then you find out what you end up with, all these cultural tropes about tech. Tech companies are cast as either progressive utopias or elitist echo chambers. DEI is framed as a threat to meritocracy and innovation, or as essential to ethical AI and inclusive design. Now, as it relates to corporate responsibility in healthcare, equity versus ideology, I'm sure many of you recall when the young man murdered the healthcare executive from United Healthcare because of a dispute he was having with the healthcare company about coverage for his back issues he had with his back. That is a stark reminder of how people can become frustrated when corporate ideology affects equity. As I said in the beginning, when equity is debated at the bedside. See, DEI rollbacks have affected clinical trial diversity, gender-affirming care, and health equity programs. Hospitals receiving federal funding are revising DEI initiatives to comply with executive orders. Why is that so disturbing? Why is that disturbing? Because if you cannot have clinical trials on a diverse segment of the population, then basically what you do is create a sort of tunnel vision where the medicines that are evolving or being created will only target the group that you are running the clinical trial on. Say, for instance, if you're running clinical trials on only white Americans, how will you know how those drugs will affect Asian Americans or Black Americans? How will you know? You'll have kind of like a reverse Tuskegee Institute clinical trial going on. The FDA removed diversity guidance for clinical trials, raising concerns about patient safety and representation. Again, how will the population, a diverse population such as what we have in the United States, be properly represented for medical treatment if those trials don't include particular certain ethnic groups? And Baldwin again has called for empathy and belonging. Baldwin's insistence on, quote, bearing the burden of reality, unquote, resonates with the need for equity in healthcare, especially when systemic racism affects cases, access, and outcomes. And that's important because I did a series several months back about painkillers. And I believe I mentioned in the series how there was a study at the University of Virginia Medical School several years ago. And the participants were the white med students, and they were all asked of their opinion about the tolerance level for blacks in America versus whites in America. Tolerance for pain, that is. And it was an overwhelming majority of the med students believe that Black Americans tolerate pain more so and better than white Americans or any other culture in America. And with that thinking, It only stands to reason that if they believe that Black Americans tolerate pain more, then they will be less inclined to prescribe them much needed pain medication. Because they won't believe, number one, that they're in pain. And if they do believe, the doctors believe they're in pain, they say, well, they'll think because of their bias, they'll believe, well, you can tolerate it. You don't need the pill. Which may explain, which I believe I also said in that series, why there are more white people addicted to drugs than there are Black people, opioids specifically. And then Baldwin emphasizes how intersectionality and belonging can frame DEI not as a checkbox, but as a lived experience, where you turn illness into testimony and not use it just to elevate patient stories as data. And then, of course, you end up with cultural tropes in healthcare. Healthcare is portrayed as either a compassionate system striving for equity, or a politicized institution pushing radical agendas. DEI in medicine is framed as either life-saving or divisive, depending on, again, political narrative and who's controlling the mic. Who's holding the mic? Doctors and hospitals become symbols of either inclusion or overreach. Now you might ask, why do these tropes even matter? They matter because these sectors are not just policy domains, they are cultural mirrors. The CRT and DEI debate turns them into shorthand for broader anxieties. Education equals fear of ideological capture. Tech equals fear of censorship or reverse discrimination. Healthcare equals fear of politicized science. Like the crazy notion Trump's talking about how female mice and male mice are being transgendered in labs. Now, how they play out in the media, these tropes, and the woke school narrative, and how the media frames them, is what we'll talk about next time. Tonight, peeps, we stepped into shadow, into a world where CRT and DEI are no longer just frameworks, but flashpoints. The stories whispered between the systems reveal more than policy ever could. But if this was the battlefield, what about the architects? In our next chapter, we trace the storytellers, the media, the influencers, the critics who shape perception with every post and proclamation. Who controls the narrative? And who gets left out of the frame? And more importantly, who controls the mic? Until then, peeps, the lounge remains open. The walls still growl truth, and so do you. I'm your host, Mr. J. Make sure you like, subscribe, share, and drop a comment. Until next time, peace.